To take revenge on his unfaithful and beautiful wife, her wealthy husband meticulously designed a murder plan. This plan not only appeared flawless but also aimed to eliminate both his wife and her lover simultaneously. However, unexpectedly, behind this seemingly perfect murder case, there was an even more elaborate and perfect killing scheme hidden. Watch the suspense unfold in this thrilling recap to find out how it all plays out. The movie's protagonist, Stephen, is a wealthy financial tycoon. His wife, Emily, is not only young and beautiful, but also comes from a wealthy family, possessing billions in assets. Their marriage was a perfect match in terms of social status and wealth. However, sometimes the quality of life is not determined by how others see it, but by how one feels inside. Due to differences in personality, Stephen and Emily's relationship soon encountered problems. Stephen was deeply engrossed in his work and was not a romantic person. On the other hand, Emily had a sensitive and sentimental nature, and she felt deeply dissatisfied with her husband's long-term neglect of her. As time passed, the gap between the couple grew wider. Before long, Emily, unwilling to remain lonely, fell for a struggling artist named David. The two frequently found opportunities to secretly meet in David's shabby rented studio. Stephen, being shrewd, soon discovered his wife's affair with the painter. However, instead of acting rashly, he first hired a private detective to take photos of their secret meetings and conduct a thorough background investigation on David. The results revealed that David was a notorious con artist with a long criminal record, specializing in deceiving wealthy women. His so-called painting skills were nothing more than a skill he picked up in prison. Clearly, his relationship with the billionaire Emily was not based on love. He was after her vast fortune. After uncovering the truth, Stephen personally visited David's residence and confronted him. He demanded that David help him kill Emily. Stephen told David that he had already devised a perfect murder plan. If David followed the plan precisely, there would be no mistakes, no police pursuit, and he would receive a reward of $500,000. To show his sincerity, Stephen offered to pay an upfront deposit of $100,000, with the remaining $400,000 to be paid upon completion of the task. Before David could respond, Stephen subtly threatened him, saying that if he refused to cooperate, he would expose all of David's past crimes to Emily. If that happened, David would lose both the woman and any financial gain. Furthermore, Stephen had discovered that a year ago, David had swindled a widow out of her entire fortune.
Six in Soledad State Prison for relieving a widow in San Francisco of her life savings.
If this case were reported to the police, David would face at least 15 years in prison. Under Stephen's coercion, David had no choice but to agree to the proposal. However, he was still puzzled. No matter how unfaithful Emily was, did Stephen really have to go as far as hiring a hitman to kill her? Stephen explained that he was a man with a strong sense of pride and dignity, and could not tolerate being cuckolded. Of course, this was just an excuse. The real reason he wanted to kill his wife was that he had recently suffered a major investment failure and was on the verge of bankruptcy. He saw this as an opportunity to get rid of Emily and inherit her vast fortune, thus resolving his financial crisis. Stephen then told David that he would bring him to his home the next day to explain the specific details of the murder plan. With that, he left. On his way out of David's apartment building, Stephen deliberately slipped an envelope into the mailbox downstairs. The next day, while Emily was out, Stephen avoided the surveillance cameras in his apartment building and brought David to his home, where he explained the details of the murder plan. At 8 p.m. tomorrow, Stephen would leave home on time, as usual, to play cards with his friends. By then, only Emily would be home. Before leaving, Stephen would find an opportunity to remove his house key from Emily's keychain, place it inside a magnetic box, and attach the box to the water pipe near the entrance. David needed to sneak into the staircase of Stephen's home before 10 p.m., avoiding surveillance along the same route he scouted today. He would then use the key Stephen had hidden at the entrance to unlock the door and hide inside the house. According to routine, Emily would be taking a bath at that time, so she wouldn't notice an intruder. At exactly 10 p.m., Stephen would use a spare phone and an anonymous SIM card to call the kitchen landline at home. Hearing the ringing while in the bath, Emily would surely leave the bathroom to answer the phone. This would be David's best chance to strike. After committing the murder, David could casually take some cash and valuable jewelry from the house. He would also pry open the lock on the back kitchen door to stage the scene as a robbery turned homicide. Finally, he would lock the front door, return Emily's key to the magnetic box, and retrace his steps to avoid surveillance while escaping the scene. With this method, they could execute a perfect murder. The reason for the elaborate key-stealing process was that breaking into the house by force would create too much noise, alerting Emily. If David simply used Stephen's key, it might expose Stephen as an accomplice. Getting a duplicate key made at a locksmith would leave evidence. That's why Stephen came up with the plan to steal the key to let David into the house. Additionally, as long as David wore gloves during the crime, to avoid leaving fingerprints, the case would be impossible to solve. After finishing his explanation of the murder plan, Stephen generously took $100,000 in advance payment from his safe and handed it to David. David had no choice but to accept. At exactly 10 p.m. the next night, while playing cards at the game room, Stephen dialed the home landline in the kitchen. Hearing the persistent ringing, Emily, who was taking a bath, had no choice but to get up, wrap herself in a bathrobe, and go answer the phone. But as soon as she picked up, she realized no one was speaking on the other end. Just as she was about to hang up, a masked man wearing gloves suddenly appeared, grabbed her by the neck, and pressed her against the sink. In a desperate struggle, Emily instinctively reached for something. Her hand landed on a sharp oven thermometer, which she immediately stabbed into the masked man's neck. The man twitched a few times before collapsing on the spot. Overwhelmed with fear and exhaustion, Emily fainted. On the other end, Stephen, hearing the silence over the phone, assumed David had successfully completed the murder. He sighed in relief, quietly hung up, and continued his card game. At 11:10 p.m., Stephen finished his game as usual. On his way home, he disposed of the spare phone and the anonymous SIM card. But when he arrived home, he immediately sensed something was wrong. In the kitchen lay a masked man's corpse. His wife Emily was curled up in the bedroom, covered in blood and trembling in fear. Just minutes earlier, Emily had regained consciousness and immediately called the police, who were now on their way. Stephen knew he was in deep trouble. Still, he pretended to stay calm and comforted his wife briefly before rushing to handle the scene. He put on rubber gloves, grabbed a screwdriver, and pried open the kitchen door lock to make it look like a break-in. Then he hid the screwdriver on the masked man's body. Next, he retrieved Emily's key from the man's pocket and put it back on her keychain. After finishing everything, Stephen finally exhaled slightly in relief. At that moment, the police arrived. The case was assigned to Detective Karaman. As soon as Detective Karaman entered the kitchen, he noticed the messy, skewed footprints near the body. Stephen quickly explained that he had left those prints while checking the corpse's vital signs.
Making sure he was dead.
But with his keen investigative experience, Detective Karaman immediately sensed Stephen's unnatural demeanor. Then the police removed the masked man's cover, and Stephen was completely stunned. The dead man wasn't David. He was a complete stranger. Further investigation revealed that the masked man was a serial burglar who had recently been released from prison. He had broken into Stephen and Emily's home simply to steal. Emily's act of killing the thief was considered self-defense. After dealing with the police investigation, the frustrated Stephen immediately sought out David to demand an explanation. David was straightforward about it. He admitted that he didn't have the guts to kill Emily himself, so he hired a professional burglar to do the job instead. Who would have thought that the unlucky fool would be so incompetent that he got himself killed by Emily instead? Fortunately, since the only witness was dead, the police had no way of linking the crime to Stephen or David for the time being. However, it was clear that they couldn't make another move anytime soon. If they acted again too soon, their murder intent would be too obvious, making it easy for the police to catch on. Stephen told David to hold off and wait for further instructions. David nodded in agreement on the surface, but the very next day, he called Stephen with a blackmail demand. He ordered Stephen to deliver the remaining $400,000 to his house immediately. It turned out that David was no fool. He had secretly recorded Stephen's murder plan when it was first discussed. If Stephen refused to pay, David would send the recording to the police, exposing Stephen's intent to hire a hitman. Now overwhelmed with problems, Stephen had no choice but to accept David's extortion. But this was far from the end of his troubles. That afternoon, when Emily returned home from an outing, she found that her key couldn't unlock the front door. It turned out that the key Stephen had taken from the corpse that night wasn't actually Emily's house key. It was the burglar's own house key. Emily's real key had already been placed back inside the magnetic box outside after the thief used it to enter Stephen's home. Since the two keys looked almost identical, Stephen, in his panic, hadn't realized he had grabbed the wrong one. At that moment, Emily finally started piecing things together. The more she thought about it, the more something felt off. Besides the fact that the key in her possession couldn't unlock the door, the call to the kitchen landline on the night of the murder now seemed highly suspicious. Emily began to suspect that her husband, Stephen, might have already known about her affair with David. Perhaps that was why he had hired someone to kill her. If that were the case, then the mysterious phone call that night must have been from Stephen himself. The obvious purpose, she concluded, was to lure her out of the bathroom and into the kitchen. Paranoid and terrified, Emily no longer felt safe staying at home. She made up an excuse and moved in with her best friend for the time being. After hearing Emily's suspicions, her best friend suggested checking Stephen's financial situation. In her friend's view, money was likely a stronger motive for murder than jealousy. After all, Stephen and Emily had never signed a prenuptial agreement when they got married. If Emily were to accidentally die, Stephen would naturally inherit all of her assets. Her friend's words suddenly made everything click in Emily's mind, prompting her to hire someone to investigate Stephen's financial situation. Sure enough, she discovered that he was on the brink of bankruptcy. Emily then relayed all her suspicions and findings to the detective Karaman. Detective Karaman also found Stephen highly suspicious. But since the police had found no direct link between Stephen and the burglar, they couldn't determine whether Stephen had truly hired a hitman. However, the detective did share a peculiar detail with Emily. During the investigation, the police discovered that the deceased burglar lived alone in a rundown house. Strangely, when he died, he had no keys on him, and the police couldn't find any keys around his residence either. This revelation sent a shock through Emily. She immediately went to the burglar's home using the address provided by the police. She then tried inserting the key from her own keychain into the burglar's door lock, and, to her astonishment, the door opened. Now the real question was, how did the burglar's key end up on her keychain? Confused and alarmed, Emily confronted Stephen directly, demanding an explanation about the key. But Stephen had already prepared for this confrontation.
Why?
To protect you.
From what?
Your lover.
He pulled out a blackmail letter, along with several photos of Emily and David in intimate situations. He then lied, claiming that David had been blackmailing him with these photos. To make his story more convincing, Stephen even revealed David's shady past to Emily. It was only then that Emily learned the shocking truth. Her so-called lover, David, was nothing more than a manipulative con artist. Still, she couldn't understand what any of this had to do with the key. Seeing that Emily was still suspicious, Stephen continued weaving his web of lies. He claimed that in order to protect his wife's reputation, he had already paid David $100,000 in hush money. But David got greedy and demanded an additional $400,000. Given his financial crisis, Stephen had refused to pay David any more money. On the night of the incident, when he returned home from playing cards, he found a masked man's corpse in the kitchen. His first instinct was that David, having failed in his blackmail attempt, had broken into the house to commit murder. Since there were no signs of forced entry, Stephen assumed that David must have stolen Emily's key to get inside. To prevent this key from exposing Emily's affair, Stephen had retrieved it from the masked man's body and put it back on Emily's keychain. He then pried open the kitchen door lock to stage the scene as a burglary gone wrong. But what he hadn't expected was that the masked man wasn't David at all. Now, it seemed likely that David had hired a hitman to do the job instead. Of course, all of this was a complete fabrication. The blackmail letter and photos were actually mailed by Stephen himself when he had first visited David's house, using David's name. His plan was simple. If David succeeded in killing Emily, these fake letters and photos would be used to frame David for the crime. And if David failed, Stephen could still use them to spin a story, shifting all the blame onto David. At this point, Emily was already overwhelmed by the betrayal and heartache of discovering David's true nature. Emotionally drained, she readily believed everything Stephen told her. She even considered going to the police to explain everything and clear things up, but Stephen immediately stopped her. He argued that with just the photos and the blackmail letter, they still had no solid proof that David had hired a killer. Worse, if David decided to fight back, the scandal could erupt into a public spectacle. Not only would Emily's reputation be ruined, but Stephen's humiliation as a cuckold would also become the talk of the town. The best course of action, Stephen insisted, was to pay David the $400,000 ransom and then cut ties with him completely. Emily found her husband's reasoning sound and abandoned the idea of going to the police. But then she suddenly remembered she had left her wedding ring at David's place. If someone found it, her affair with David would be exposed. When Stephen learned about this, he volunteered to retrieve the ring for her. At the same time, he would personally deliver the $400,000 to David. Stephen handed over the $400,000 ransom to David, hoping that would be the end of the ordeal. At last, Stephen arrived at David's home with a bag full of cash, only to find that the door was unlocked, but David was nowhere to be seen. Inside the house, he found Emily's wedding ring along with a note left by David. It turned out David, fearing that Stephen might harm him, had changed the meeting location to a crowded public park. Just as Stephen was preparing to head there, the landline phone in David's house suddenly rang. Stephen casually picked it up and discovered it was a call from a travel agency. The purpose of the call was to confirm whether David would be able to catch his train later that afternoon. It seemed David was planning to take the money and flee. Seizing the opportunity, Stephen tricked the travel agency staff into revealing David's train details. Then he proceeded to the park where he handed over the $400,000 in cash to David. After receiving the money, David returned the tape recording of Stephen's murder-for-hire plan. Then, carrying his bag of cash, he headed straight to the train station and boarded his reserved VIP compartment. Little did he know that as soon as he shut the compartment door, a shadowy figure emerged from the corner and stabbed him repeatedly. That figure, of course, was Stephen. In his final moments, David struggled to pull a delivery receipt from his pocket, sneering that Stephen wouldn't be able to enjoy his victory for long. As it turned out, David had already made a duplicate of the recording and mailed it to Emily. Upon hearing this, Stephen hurriedly cleaned up the scene and rushed home with the cash. At that moment, Emily was standing dazed on the balcony with several freshly delivered packages sitting on the table. Among them was the package containing the tape David had sent. Seeing that Emily hadn't opened any of the packages yet, Stephen let out a deep sigh of relief. He quickly took advantage of her distraction, locking both the $400,000 and the package containing the tape inside his personal safe. After securing everything, he handed Emily back her wedding ring, then went straight to the bathroom to take a shower and wash away the cold sweat. When Stephen stepped out of the bathroom, Emily told him she was heading out to buy some things and would also call a locksmith to replace their door lock the next day, since she still couldn't find her keys. Her words suddenly triggered a realization in Stephen. Only now did he fully piece things together. On the night of the incident, after opening the door, the burglar must have put the keys back in the magnetic key holder outside. That's why Stephen had mistakenly taken the burglar's keys and placed them on Emily's keychain. In other words, Emily's real keys were still in the magnetic key holder. The moment Emily left the house, Stephen rushed to the doorway and retrieved Emily's keys from the magnetic holder behind the water pipe. But what he didn't know was that Emily had been secretly watching him the entire time. Stephen had made a fatal mistake when he returned home earlier. He had been so anxious that he forgot to dispose of the bag that had contained the ransom money. Instead, he had simply tossed it carelessly beside the safe. While Stephen was in the shower, Emily had accidentally noticed the empty bag and guessed that her husband must have hurriedly hidden its contents inside the safe. Driven by curiosity, she entered the safe's code and opened it. Stephen had always believed like a fool that his wife didn't know his safe's password. But in reality, Emily, who was always observant, had memorized the code long ago without him realizing it. And at this critical moment, she found the tape recording hidden inside. That was how she discovered the shocking truth, that Stephen was the mastermind behind the attempt on her life. To further confirm whether Stephen had personally participated in the murder attempt, Emily deliberately mentioned the keys in front of him. Unexpectedly, Stephen fell right into the trap. He unknowingly admitted not only to planning the murder, but also to directly taking part in the attempt on her life. With things now out in the open, Emily didn't bother pretending anymore. She tore off the last mask of pretense and threatened to call the police to report Stephen. After saying this, she even stepped forward and landed a solid punch on Stephen's face, completely enraging him. His murderous intent flared up once again, and the couple got into a violent struggle. In the chaos, Emily reached into her pocket, pulled out a handgun, and shot Stephen dead on the spot. That gun was the very one she had just taken from Stephen's safe. After receiving the emergency call, the police quickly arrived at the scene, with the investigation once again falling into the hands of the detective Karaman. He had already been deeply suspicious of Stephen, and now, seeing the injuries on Emily's face and listening to the tape recording, he was convinced Emily's act of killing was purely in self-defense, and she bore no legal responsibility for it. And with that, the movie came to an end. On the surface, the movie refers to the husband's plan to murder his wife, but in reality, it hints at the wife's ultimate counterattack against her husband. After listening to the recording, Emily clearly developed the intention to kill Stephen. That's why she hid the gun in her pocket, deliberately provoked her husband with both words and actions, and in the end, used their scuffle as the perfect cover to shoot him, transforming a premeditated murder into a seemingly justified act of self-defense.